Maybe we can break down talking about the videos. Hi, I'm Devina from The Wire, and we're here today with Madhu from PLD, Partners in Law Development, and Samreen from CoMotion Films, and we're here to discuss workplace harassment and consent. Hi, so could you please just introduce yourselves and talk about the project, the collaborative project between the two of you?
Hello, this is Madhu from Partners for Law in Development. I just a bit of a background why PLD made the videos on consent and rejection. It's over a course of last 4 to 5 years of our work on sexual harassment at the workplace. We've worked with governments, we've worked with organizations, public and private educational institutions, and gathered a lot of case studies that have come, often engaging with the institution on how to troubleshoot. And last year we looked at this documentation and classified into different types. And one big chunk that emerged was really about sexual, to do with confusions about expressing sexual interest between peers. And we really felt that this really significant area was getting left out and eclipsed in the discussions of predatory sexual harassment, and certainly required a different approach and conversation, much deeper and serious engagement on issues of sexuality. Which is why then we thought we'd make these videos on consent as well as rejection as two parts of the same coin, really, with the CoMotion Films. And Samreen will talk about that.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Samreen from CoMotion Films. I'm basically representing the filmmakers. Umang and Shabani couldn't be here today with us. So basically, when Madhu approached us with this subject, and with the entire database of stories that she had, we kind of jumped, because there is such a gap, in the kind of discourse that is there out now, that we ourselves keep talking about such stories and such kind of incidents that we relate with. But when you go out there, you don't have much conversations. It's always about criminality. It's always about black and white. It is always about binaries. You look at people only as victims and as perpetrators. And when you do that, and when you see such content, there is a kind of distancing that happens, and you kind of say, no, this can't be me. This has never happened to me, and this is not something I would ever do. And we wanted to break away from that, and that for us it was an opportunity to create that kind of content. And that's when we kind of got together with Neil Chaudhary, who's our playwright, who kind of wrote all the stories and also directed the actors. So yeah.
Okay, thanks. Could you just take me through some of the videos that we've been talking about, and the research process behind them, and how you perhaps chose on those specific cases out of a vast array of possible sexual harassment scenarios?
Yeah, so we actually wouldn't call them sexual harassment scenarios. We would call them transgressions and misunderstandings. And we do want to ensure that when the engagement with these stories is non-judgmental, where we don't identify people as creeps and villains and some as victims, because you just see how every story has so many shades of grey in it. So we picked up different types of stories here. What we saw running through various stories was the huge presence of social media in the lives of young people. That's one thing we wanted to speak with. And the intimacies developed on social media that can be denied by one party later on, a blurring of boundaries, a desire to be friendly at all costs to build social capital when you're either in higher education, in college, or when you're in a job, a new job, and often your first job. So we found that there were these realities which were shaping much of the confusions. And then, of course, added to this is how do you transition from from a friendship to something more intimate. And that transition is a very awkward one. Remember also that having criminalized sexuality up till 18 years under Indian law, we don't leave young people with many tools of information. Certainly you don't have any robust, comprehensive sexuality education. So in their early adulthood, they're completely clueless. They're going by whatever popular culture says to them. They're going by pornography or whatever other resource they lay their hands on. And it's in a sense at the policy level we've set the stage for mistakes, and that I think is something that we should really worry about and try to engage more proactively. So these were the situations within which a lot of this unfolds, different stories. The other aspect we do wish to highlight, which we often forget, that one aspect, the flip side of consent, is rejection. Often when you are brave enough to ask somebody or express an emotion, you risk a chance of being rejected, or when your relationship breaks up. And then the kind of harm that follows, and that's also something we do need to engage with, because it's simpler said than done. None of us take rejection very easily in our lives, in any sphere of our lives. So it is very challenging for young people, and we need to speak to these issues.
I think Madhu has covered most of what we thought about. But I think it was challenging for us. I mean, we had all the research material and all the database from PLD and the stories, and we hashed it out with them. But we were talking about a very confusing territory. We were talking about relationships in the workplace, because it's not a sterile kind of an environment. They're real people with real intimacies, and there is a lot of confusion that happens there. As she said, people come from outside, they don't have social capital, they are very friendly, they don't know the rules. And I think for us it was very important that this ends up becoming sort of at least beginning of a conversation about what are these rules of the game, so that this shooting in the dark doesn't happen. Because right now everything is kind of being talked in terms of the law, in terms of where you cross the line, and then there is the black hole, right? So at least just start this conversation about what are the rules. What do you mean by consent? No matter what your relationship is on social media, you don't think that is a serious thing, but you cannot go ahead without consent. How do you deal with pain? Pain is real, but you do not go and harm somebody. So for that, it was very important to us to be sensitive, to be compassionate, not only to both parties, and at the same time not really say that you are right and you are wrong. And that's where I think even the videos are being interpreted in that manner, because there is no right and wrong way. They're very real situations, and they happen between two people, and two people with their own set of desires.
So I think they've done a great job with making them very non-judgmental. Because if you see the rejection video of Sonal, for instance, where she gets dumped by her boyfriend and he blocks her from all social media platforms, and so she's suddenly left with this situation where she doesn't exist in his life anymore, so to say. And so all her efforts to try and talk it out get seen as madly pursuing him. And for all we know, we leave it to your imagination whether, to what degree it might, and it may vary, so we don't spell out that. But finally what she does is get her brother, she shares all the WhatsApp messages and photos, and her brother goes and beats up this guy. So we could, in the classic binary conversation, it's no means no. And so we are not engaging with what happens. But here we wish people will ask questions about how do you say no when you say no? How do you break up? Are there rules about breaking up? do we have to be sort of generous to each other when we are breaking up? Or do we suddenly shut somebody out? And of course, when you are hurt, one of the things the script at the back talks about is heal yourself. We don't say, well, it's your business, too bad, you can't take a rejection. But we do say heal, don't harm. So we are speaking and are respectful to that pain that follows. So I think in that sense, I like the complexity that every video has a story in which there is something that we can open up and discuss about the way we play these roles out in a relationship or a friendship.
Yeah, because we are sort of talking about consent a lot more now. It's in the jargon a lot more. But there's still... there's not much nuance when we talk about it. It's still looked at in terms of binaries. It's still looked at very much from a legal point of view, very much from a criminal point of view. So these videos were really interesting in looking at maybe the instances before it reaches that point, the hazy instances that are still pretty blurry. Because it talks more about, relationships and desire and that aspect of consent. So can you talk a little bit more about the videos, like what specific videos did you make and did you enjoy making, or what the complicated parts of the videos?
I think we had such interesting stories and incidents and complex incidents that PLD had researched and recorded, that we had actually all the raw material with us, and everything, that all the stories which are there are based on those real stories. But I think our challenge was keeping that subtlety but making the transgression sharper. Yeah, making the transgression sharper. And I think Neil constantly kind of grappled. Do I need to stop? Yeah. Oh, okay. So Neil kind of constantly grappled with this thing of relatability, so that, because I think for him one of the most important things was that when you go and do these sexual harassment workshops, people constantly think, no, this is not something that could have happened with us. The relatability kind of goes missing. And so it was very important for us to do that. And I think even when we talk about, in Rejection, the story where the boy ends up kissing someone in a party, and after that, they're like, he goes ahead and talks about her because it doesn't work out and she's already in a relationship, but he is regretful, he is remorseful of what has happened, and we don't hear that at all. We don't have such content out there where a guy does think about what has happened, and in fact at that point in time it is he who has left his job and he has gone somewhere else. So it was very important for us to talk about these things, to have these stories put in, or the story in Consent where it's a call center, a guy in the call center, and they both travel together in taxis at night, and she sleeps on his shoulder, and he thinks that that is a signal, that's consent, but that is not consent. And it's crazy because while we were editing the videos, we kept saying, but she did sleep on his shoulder, but she was sleeping, and how do you define that? So these are spirals, and unless and until you go into depths of things, you don't kind of understand it. And until you keep talking about this is good and this is this is bad and this is punishable and this can pass, we are not going to understand. Youth is not going to understand what's going on. It's a very, very confusing time. So for us, I think that is what it was. It was challenging and it was stimulating to make videos that people are going to see themselves in.
Okay. Thanks. So you spoke about the relatability. And especially in the workplace, when you have these seminars, a lot of them can be kind of sometimes alienating if you're only seen as one or the other, as either a victim, or if you're not, you're automatically classed as a perpetrator. So so this would be probably, do you think it would be interesting and more relatable to get people talking about these issues and get people in these seminars where they're learning the laws behind a lot of the darker aspects of sexual harassment, especially in the workplace, and getting them into into having these conversations? That's one thing. And I also wanted to ask you, what do you think these videos, like, what would they do? From a legal standpoint? How are we talking about, when we're talking about these fuzzy areas of consent, is there anything legally binding here? Is there?
So we definitely don't see law sort of, you get legislations on every subject under the sun, but a certain subject is not defined by law alone. Yeah. So to gain an understanding on the nuances of consent and rejection, we also looked at psychoanalysis and other disciplines which give us a better insight on subjectivity of the person, on cognition, abilities to sort of really be clear about what you're feeling. So as an organization whose primary aim is to achieve social justice and hopefully change society, we are looking at more transformatory ways. Even if the law was implemented at its fullest, which we know in India is rarely ever the case, or in any country, let's say, that is not the main engine through which social change happens. So we really do need to reach out to constituencies who are vulnerable, and we feel the youth are. We have sort of ended up protecting them from their own sexual expression up till 18 years. Under POCSO, we've criminalized sexual consent. And we don't do much by way of comprehensive sexuality education. So what is it that they have other than the law and punishment? In the area which is most natural aspect of their lives, of every human life. Which is why I think that workshops would help if someone facilitated it well. Because we could use these tools, but if we fail to untangle the different issues that are there, we might not take full advantage that the videos offer. Because I remember while we were sort of processing this, and I must mention colleague Dipta Bhog, who was very much part of the brainstorming, and when we were looking at cases about how not to create any sort of black and white situation. And then I remember Neil, when he was working with the actors, one of the things he shared was that the actors were always asking whether this guy is a creep.
Right.
And so they had to, at that, in the workshop of actors, had to unlearn that there is, you're just a person, you're not a creep. You're just navigating these feelings. This happened to you. So because we have this, we end up caricaturizing people as being so bad. And yes, of course, one is not undermining predatory harassment or people who intentionally seek, try to sort of leverage their position to abuse or to inflict harm. But we are also, when we are only using that sort of framework, we are completely eclipsing this reality. And I really think the failure to talk about sexuality and sex positivity, that we have come to a point where everything is subterfuge.
Right, because sometimes it does seem like you're only seen as a criminal act, and you're missing out. And not to, of course, not to minimize the very real, predatory behavior that does definitely exist and needs to be called out. But that is where maybe law is becoming more. Sort of these.
Yes, and the law does provide for conciliation and preventive work, and I feel this aspect, preventive work, is not about speaking about the law to people and telling them, if you do this, this is the punishment. It's more about engaging with them and their reality. A lot of people, a large number of people, find their love interests at work or in college. So there's definitely desire is very active, as is attraction. How do they play? How do they play it out? We can't simply stifle it by saying if you do this set of injunctions, and yet we know a lot of harassment is very subjectively experienced. So if people are not talking to each other, you suddenly have spats, as we saw in some of the videos, where there are two people who seem to be getting along, and then suddenly they don't want to see each other. And can we not have some... Now we do have, for example, can we not have conversation around those things with the two people concerned? So one of the questions I would like to ask is, yes, we do want to set up sexual harassment committees everywhere in colleges. Do they have counselors in colleges? Do they have therapists in colleges? Do they have any kind of helplines where people with relationship issues or issues of cultural, tensions that relocating to a new city causes? Do we have that? We don't have that. And that's exactly what festers these confusions. So we need to be intervening at preventive levels to enable people, but we don't do that. We just kind of invest heavily in policing. And I'm not saying that we have any solution to sexual harassment just yet. The law is only 4.5 years old, and certainly is not being implemented in its spirit or in its letter properly. But the prevention doesn't just happen on its own. You have to plan for it. You have to think it through.
Right. So we're sort of talking about a more holistic approach to looking at fuzzy, hazy issues of consent. A lot of the videos also, they're mostly talking about just inspiring conversations about these topics. How does one, in a workplace specifically, it sort of seems that if a man specifically is going to talk to a woman, he's almost always seen as a transgressor. Like how can they initiate conversations that might not be about work, but in the workplace or with a colleague, without being a transgressor or being seen as one?
Madhu,
I mean, there's no...
Well, I don't have sort of an answer. You can't. But I think in every situation that unfolds where there is a transgression, you can talk about that. And there are often, if there is no existing friendship, or if there's lots to talk about. One can talk about the weather, one can talk about...
So to have a foundation.
There's so much else on which you can... one can talk about sports, one can talk about politics,
nothing personal.
Cinema.
Right, yeah.
There's a lot to discover whether or not you have any common ground. And that's how people sort of can build rapport. And if they see that's going nowhere, what I often say in trainings is that this instantaneous setting up of WhatsApp groups, which becomes a conduit for all manner of, jokes, humor in really bad taste, messaging that is over the top, and a desire to outdo each other in sort of being visible.
Right.
That is perhaps, but I mean, it's really something. It's a thing of the times. I can't say very much, but I do think that a lot of boundary transgression can happen around those areas where we instantly want to be Facebook friends and then post and so on
every post
before we get to know
So it's a
people.
bunch
But
of
then
things, yeah.
but then one is not being judgmental. It's also a world in which social media allows for friendships to be developed across cities where you don't know each other. So I think people just need to have a sense of judgment, and if they feel something is creeping them out or something that is creating a sense of discomfort, to talk about it rather than to be silent. And that's what we are hoping it will encourage, greater conversations. because there are stories where somebody didn't say anything until that moment when it suddenly breaks down.
Yeah.
Because you give. So is silence one of the questions that sort of talking with the other experts from different disciplines I learned, is silence also contributing to a false sense of intimacy that the person who then makes the first move acts upon?
Yeah.
So we are trying to see how many ways are possible to sort of make ourselves more articulate and much more self-aware in these situations.
Right.
I just want to add, because she was talking about WhatsApp groups and conversations and intimacies on WhatsApp, and it's such a real thing. And we have a story about the lab assistant, and her relationship, which mostly was on WhatsApp, and she goes on to say, "Par wo to WhatsApp tha," negating and dismissing it fully. But there are relationships are of various kinds, and they happen on various platforms, and you cannot be dismissive of it. And in fact, with that video, what we were trying to say was not, and a lot of people have thought so, but we are not saying that your relationship on WhatsApp is correct or incorrect.
No judgment on it. Yeah.
What we're trying to say is that you think you have a relationship on WhatsApp, go and ask the other person. Right. Is there a relationship? The whole story was about the boy outing, making it public, and not about if there was a relation. I mean, clearly in the story there was something going on between them, and they were talking with each other till late at night, and they were sharing a lot of personal details with each other. But he goes out and shares it on another social media platform, and that is what the transgression is about. So even when we talk about consent, we are talking about various layers of consent. It's not only at saying you are my girlfriend, in a private room. It's also about what somebody wants others to know.
Display to the world. Yeah, especially.
So it's actually, interestingly, a lot of the stories are not about the sexual act which you are saying yes or no to. A lot of the consent discussions are about, did you have to take consent for that. But actually, consent is really a part of one's life, or leveling off. I don't even sometimes, I think consent is a very legally defined term, but leveling off and being sort of on common ground about things.
On the same page.
So it is at the stage when you think you're great friends, where you have a great vibe, to the point where you think it's actually moving to a different territory. All those stages, to the point you want to make the first sexual contact, however slight it is. And I mean, in that car story as well, so you have the girl sleeping on his shoulder on more than one occasion, and sometimes holding his hand. And so, we ourselves were very ambivalent about all these situations. So we are not judging them. What we are saying is, perhaps if there is something developing, then it's a good idea to check whether there is something shared, or whether it's just the silent comfort of getting close to someone without stating it.
Right. So a lot of these are about just having more conversations, more discourse about this. And even if someone is approaching someone and might feel like they're coming across as a creep, if they've had these conversations, they can be more self-reflective. You also spoke a lot about just asking someone, for their consent, or asking someone, clarifying this, like verbalizing it a lot, and it's also a lot with say yes or say no movement. What about situations where someone wants to say yes but can't because of certain restraints in the office or familial restraints or anything like that? How is one to interpret consent in those kind of situations?
I'm not sure what you meant. I mean, offices that have a policy about forbidding.
Maybe if they have a policy where it's sometimes if someone wants to say yes but they are saying no.
Generally we are not encouraged to say yes, because there is a stereotype about the girl who must be chaste. Chaste, I mean, in more than one way. Chaste as in being very pure and sexually sort of immune. And the other as in, that you have to be desired much more. There has to be much more sort of pursuit before you actually take somebody seriously. So there are both things happening in popular culture simultaneously. So again, if one is, I think part of talking about sexuality is not feeling embarrassed about your desire and acknowledging it and acting on it, but being very clear to yourself what you're doing. So that I think is necessary, because we are often told that women do not have desire, but they only consent to a man approaching them. So I think talking about sexuality does allow us to look at many of the ways in which we have constructed masculinity, femininity in ways that box us. So also not having to say no only because you can't say yes, because that is one of the biggest problems. In fact, in work around sexuality, you always say that if you don't have the right to say yes, how can you say no?
Right.
Because it's just that your sexuality is taboo completely. So we have to create a sex positive space for women to be able to say yes, and then also talk about ways of coping with rejection, because it's not as if once you say yes, a relationship is there to continue. Things change, and rejections can be very painful. Self-esteem and personhood is also tied up, unfortunately, with rejection, although it has nothing to do with sexual rejection. But how are we going to explain this? If we don't break these concepts down, people sort of act upon a magnified sense of hurt and destruction of self-esteem and personhood, and then they play out all kinds of violent acts.
Right.
And we certainly don't want to keep perpetuating that. So hopefully we can start sort of unraveling the world of rejection too.
Yeah, and how is the person who is being, if you're saying, how is the person on the receiving end of this supposed to react? So suppose they know that this person wants to say yes, but all they're getting verbally is a no. Are they supposed to interpret that as consent, or should they wait for a verbal yes? Or is it's not going to be that clear, but how does one navigate that?
There's more than yes and no. I mean, there's just, people are not, it's not like, I think sometimes we oversimplify it because of, there's a legal definition now, and we have a legal term which we sort of, but that's not real life. We don't, so people need to talk to each other and level off.
Right.
And consent happens within that conversation. Yeah. It may not happen as a yes and a no. It may happen in various ways. So I think there's space for all of that. So to reduce it all to a Q&A is not is not really. It's also in the course of, it's also a continuing thing. You do consent. It's not a one-time thing.
Right.
So even where you have said yes to a relationship, you may not be ready for all kinds of sexual intimacy. Right. You may be ready for some. And within that, I think it's not just about yes and no, but it's about what pleasures you. Yeah. Do you have the capacity to share with each other what pleasures you? And
it's a constant understanding.
So
that needs to be undertaken.
More than a yes and no, we are talking about being in agreement. We're talking about compatibility. And when you talk about compatibility, it's when you want the same things out of whatever that you are in together. It's the togetherness aspect of it, and that is not just about a yes and no.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Do you have any last thoughts on anything at all relating to this entire conversation?
We'd like people to comment on the videos and have,
discussions about it.
Yes, have discussions about it. And of course, we are using the 2 hashtags, Did You Ask and Must You Harm, to talk about consent and rejection. So I hope they can use these hashtags and take forward so we can sort of find a way to collate all these conversations.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we're...
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.